On the morning of April 18, 1998, the Marion County Highway Department in central Kansas posted a notice that hardly anyone bothered to read. 12 retired windmill blades, removed from abandoned stock watering towers along county roads, would be sold as scrap at the county maintenance yard outside Hillsboro. Most buyers came looking for steel by the pound. Nobody imagined those faded galvanized blades had another purpose. By noon, only one bidder remained. 72-year-old Martha Ellison, whose family had farmed the same 320 acres since 1951, quietly offered $186 for the entire lot. Men standing beside the loading dock stared at her as though she had mistaken junk for treasure. The blades looked exhausted. Rust freckles covered their edges. Several were bent where decades of Kansas wind had fought against frozen bearings and neglected towers. County workers had stacked them in uneven piles beside cracked concrete barriers, already expecting the scrapyard truck to haul them away before sunset. Martha studied each one without speaking. Her hands carried 50 years of evidence. Thick knuckles. Tiny white scars from baling wire. Fingernails stained by grease that never truly washed away. She touched every blade as if greeting old neighbors instead of discarded steel. Standing nearby was Ethan Brooks, 36 years old, the county's newly appointed public works engineer. Fresh from Kansas State University and proud of every spreadsheet he carried, Ethan believed efficiency solved nearly everything. He admired modern irrigation pivots, GPS-guided combines, and engineered storm shelters. Looking at Martha's purchase, he saw only obsolete metal. He walked toward her carrying a clipboard. "Mrs. Ellison," he said politely, "you know scrapyards are paying around 6 cents a pound. You'll spend more hauling these than they're worth." She smiled. "I didn't buy steel." Ethan frowned. "You bought 12 windmill blades." "No," Martha answered. "I bought 12 answers." Several workers exchanged puzzled looks. One chuckled softly. Another shook his head. Nobody understood what she meant. Let me tell you about Martha Ellison. She and her late husband, Raymond, had bought their first machine together in May 1954, a used 1949 Farmhouse M, 44 drawbar horsepower, purchased from a dealer in McPherson County for $1,760. Raymond always said the tractor sounded happiest pulling a grain drill across spring fields after a night of rain. Every winter he drained the fluids, checked every bearing, polished the magneto cover, and coated exposed metal with a thin layer of oil before covering it with canvas. After Raymond died from pneumonia in January 1989, Martha maintained the tractor exactly the same way. Every bolt carried a memory. Every dent had a story. Machines, she believed, remembered the people who respected them. The farmhouse still started on cold mornings after barely 2 turns of the crankshaft. That mattered. Not because newer tractors were weaker. Because reliability grows from care more often than age. County workers loaded the blades onto Martha's aging flatbed trailer with an old cable crane. They clanged against one another like church bells without a congregation. Ethan watched the overloaded trailer sway. "I hope you've got a plan." "I always do." "What kind of plan needs 12 broken windmill blades?" "The kind that waits for weather." That answer earned another round of laughter. This time it spread across the entire yard. One mechanic slapped another on the shoulder. A truck driver leaned against his pickup, laughing hard enough to remove his cap. Even Ethan laughed, though more out of disbelief than cruelty. It echoed across the maintenance lot, carried by a warm April breeze. Martha never looked offended. She simply secured another chain across the stack, tightened the binder one click farther, climbed into her faded 1983 Ford F-250, and drove away at barely 40 miles an hour. The laughter faded long before she disappeared over the hill. During the following weeks, neighbors noticed strange changes across the Ellison farm. Instead of repairing fences damaged during winter, Martha dug deep post holes around the western edge of her property. The old windmill blades disappeared one by one. Some stood upright beneath fresh concrete. Others vanished inside long trenches running across the highest ridge overlooking her wheat fields. Nobody understood the pattern. Rumors spread anyway. Some claimed she planned to build giant sculptures. Others guessed she had finally grown lonely enough to invent projects that kept memories alive. Ethan drove past twice during bridge inspections. Each visit left him more confused. The blades were never arranged like decorations. They formed angles, repeating distances, carefully measured lines. Everything appeared deliberate. Late one afternoon, he stopped beside the gravel road and watched Martha working with her farmhouse. The old tractor pulled a homemade post-driver Raymond had welded nearly 30 years earlier. The engine never rushed. Its steady rhythm echoed across fresh-plowed ground like a heartbeat too stubborn to quit. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless, only because they never understood why you kept it? Most people judge value by today's price. Farmers often measure it by tomorrow's storm. Ethan climbed the fence and asked the question that had bothered him since auction day. "What exactly are you building?" Martha wiped dirt from her gloves, looked toward the western horizon, where dark spring clouds gathered far beyond the Flint Hills, and answered so quietly he almost missed the words. "I'm building the only thing this county forgot it was ever supposed to have." At that moment, the wind shifted. The wind arrived from the southwest, carrying the dry smell of freshly turned soil and distant rain. Martha Ellison stood motionless for several seconds, watching the clouds build along the horizon. Ethan Brooks followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Spring storms were common across Kansas. They came. They passed. Farmers complained about them for a day or two, then returned to work. Martha had learned long ago that not every storm announced itself the same way. Some arrived with thunder. Others arrived with silence. She climbed onto the worn steel seat of her 1949 farmhouse and eased the throttle forward. The old four-cylinder engine answered with the same steady rhythm it had carried for nearly half a century. Slowly, almost patiently, she drove toward the highest ridge on her property, where 6 of the salvaged windmill blades had already disappeared beneath fresh concrete. Ethan remained at the fence. Curiosity finally outweighed skepticism. The next Saturday he returned, this time leaving the county pickup behind and arriving in his own dusty Chevrolet. Martha was already working before sunrise. She handed him a shovel. "If you're here to laugh again," she said with a faint smile, "you'll have to wait until lunch." Ethan laughed awkwardly. "I came because I honestly want to understand." For the first time since the auction, Martha nodded with approval. "That's a better reason." Together they uncovered one of the buried blade assemblies. Ethan expected random scrap welded together. Instead, he found careful engineering. Each galvanized blade had been anchored vertically inside reinforced concrete nearly 4 feet below grade. Heavy steel braces tied neighboring blades together underground with salvaged railroad plate and threaded rods. Above the surface, only the curved portions remained exposed, forming a staggered barrier stretching across the ridge. Nothing about it looked accidental. Nothing looked decorative. It looked calculated. Let me tell you about western Kansas before center pivot irrigation transformed so much of the landscape. Older farmers understood that the prairie itself once slowed the wind. Native grasses bent instead of breaking. Shelter belts planted during the Dust Bowl decades interrupted violent gusts before they reached homes and barns. But as many windbreaks disappeared and open fields grew larger, certain farms became exposed in ways that maps could never fully explain. Martha's grandfather had spoken about this often. He kept handwritten weather journals beginning in March 1935, recording wind direction, hail size, rainfall, and even where drifting snow collected after blizzards. Those notebooks never left the farmhouse. Ethan spent nearly an hour reading them that afternoon. The entries seemed repetitive until one pattern became impossible to ignore. Every destructive windstorm approached from almost exactly the same corridor. Every major tornado that crossed nearby land weakened after climbing the same ridge Martha was now reinforcing. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps not. "You really think these blades matter?" Ethan asked. "I think the ground remembers." He looked puzzled. "The ground? The shape of it? The trees that used to stand here? The old windmills? Even the fences people removed because they looked old-fashioned. Every generation changes the land a little. Sometimes they forget what the people before them already learned." Her answer lingered with him all evening. A week later, Ethan requested archived aerial photographs from the county records office. The oldest images dated back to 1956. Comparing them with modern satellite photographs revealed something surprising. The Ellison farm once contained 3 long shelter belts, dozens of hedge trees, and several wind-powered stockwells arranged almost exactly where Martha had begun placing the salvaged blades. Over 40 years, nearly all of them had disappeared. Modern efficiency had opened the fields. Modern efficiency had also removed obstacles that once interrupted straight-line winds. That discovery unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. Let me tell you about old windmills. Most people remember only the towers turning lazily above cattle tanks. Few realize those galvanized blades were designed to survive decades of constant stress. Each blade flexed slightly under heavy wind rather than resisting it completely. That flexibility spread force across the entire wheel, preventing sudden failure. Steel that bends a little often survives longer than steel determined never to move. Farmers understood that lesson. So did good blacksmiths. Sometimes surviving means yielding just enough. There is another lesson hidden inside old machinery. People often confuse horsepower with strength. Horsepower measures how quickly work can be done. Torque measures the turning force available to keep doing it when resistance grows. An engine with modest horsepower but strong low-speed torque can pull a heavy load steadily without racing. That is one reason older tractors like the Farmhouse M earned such loyal reputations. They were built to keep pulling, not simply to impress with larger numbers. In farming, steady effort almost always outlasts flashy performance. By early May 1998, Martha had installed all 12 windmill blades. From above, the pattern resembled a broad crescent facing southwest. From ground level, it appeared almost meaningless. Neighbors still whispered. Some called it harmless eccentricity. Others predicted the county would eventually order the structures removed. Even Ethan couldn't say whether Martha's idea would accomplish anything. Yet he no longer laughed. One Friday afternoon, the National Weather Service issued its first significant severe weather outlook for central Kansas that season. Television meteorologists spoke of unstable air, unusually high wind shear, and conditions favorable for rotating supercells later in the month. Farmers noticed. Farmers always noticed. Martha simply folded the forecast, placed it beside Raymond's weather journals, and walked outside to grease the farmhouse front axle. She worked slowly, methodically, without fear. Ethan drove past at sunset and found her sitting on the porch, watching the western sky glow crimson beneath towering clouds. "I hope you're wrong," he admitted quietly. "So do I," Martha answered. "But if I'm right..." She never finished the sentence. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, a tornado warning had just been issued, and the first emergency sirens began to sound. The first tornado sirens reached Marion County just after 6:40 p.m. on May 27, 1998. People who had lived on the Kansas prairie long enough knew the difference between a routine warning and the kind that tightened every stomach in the room. This one felt different. The air had gone strangely still. Birds disappeared from fence lines. Even the cattle stopped drifting through the pasture and gathered close together, their heads pointed toward the southwest. Martha Ellison closed the weather journal Raymond had started more than 40 years earlier and slipped it into the kitchen drawer. Then she walked outside. The Farmhouse M was already parked beside the machine shed, its fuel tank full, its battery freshly charged, exactly as Raymond had always insisted before storm season. Martha rested one hand on the faded red hood for a moment. "You've carried this family long enough," she whispered. "One more night." Across the county, Ethan Brooks stood inside the emergency operations room watching radar images update every few minutes. The meteorologist from Wichita spoke in a calm voice, but the graphics on the screen were anything but calm. A massive rotating supercell was tracking northeast. Its projected path crossed directly toward the Ellison farm. Ethan stared at the map. Then he noticed something unusual. The projected circulation wasn't moving randomly. It followed almost the exact corridor Martha had shown him in Raymond's weather journals. His chair scraped backward. Without waiting for permission, he grabbed his truck keys. One deputy called after him. "Where are you going?" "To warn someone who already knows." Rain reached the farm first. Not heavy. Just enough to coat every fence wire with tiny beads of water that reflected the darkening sky. Then came the wind. It arrived in powerful, steady gusts before becoming something else entirely. Trees bent until their branches almost touched the ground. Loose sheets of tin lifted from old barns miles away. Dust spiraled across wheat fields in twisting columns that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Martha wasn't hiding. She stood near the machine shed, watching the ridge where the 12 salvaged windmill blades rose from the earth in their long sweeping arc. Each blade hummed. Softly at first. Then louder. Not spinning. Singing. The sound carried across the pasture like the low note of a distant church organ. Ethan's pickup bounced into the driveway. "You have to leave." Martha shook her head. "No. The tornado's coming." "I know. You can't stay here. I've spent 47 years learning this land." She looked toward the ridge. "Tonight we'll find out whether I listened well enough." The laughter from the county yard echoed in Ethan's memory. It felt very far away now. The western sky turned almost black. Then green. A color no farmer ever forgot after seeing it once. The tornado emerged from the rain like something carved from smoke. Wide. Violent. Moving with terrifying purpose. Power poles snapped one after another. Grain bins rolled across open fields like children's toys. Roof panels spun hundreds of feet into the air before disappearing inside the rotating wall of debris. The roar became almost impossible to describe. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It sounded like every freight train in Kansas passing through the same valley at once. Ethan felt his legs refuse to move. Martha remained perfectly still. Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you believed you were making a terrible mistake? That feeling isn't excitement. It isn't pride. It's responsibility. Because if you're wrong, the cost belongs to everyone. The tornado reached the western ridge. For one endless second, nothing happened. Then the wind struck the buried blade barrier. The exposed galvanized steel flexed under the enormous pressure exactly as it had been designed to decades earlier. Instead of acting like rigid walls, the blades absorbed and redirected bursts of straight-line wind sweeping ahead of the tornado. Airflow that might have accelerated uninterrupted across the open ridge broke into dozens of smaller turbulent currents. The tornado itself did not stop. No barrier of scrap steel could stop something that powerful. But the violent inflow feeding its lowest circulation changed. Only slightly. Sometimes slightly is enough. The funnel lurched. Its base narrowed. The western edge climbed the ridge while the eastern circulation drifted toward an empty pasture instead of the farmhouse. The machine shed shuddered. Windows exploded inward. The farmel rocked on its tires but never overturned. Several of the buried windmill blades bent nearly 30 degrees before springing partially back into place. Fence posts disappeared. A grain wagon rolled into a ditch. Then, almost unbelievably, the tornado continued northeast across open grazing land instead of cutting directly through the Ellison homestead. The farmhouse still stood. So did the barn. So did the old farmel. Ethan couldn't speak. Neither could Martha. They simply watched as the monster crossed another mile of prairie before lifting into a curtain of rain. Silence returned so suddenly it almost hurt. Emergency vehicles began arriving within minutes. Neighbors followed. Some had lost roofs. Some had lost machine sheds. Others had lost nearly everything. One by one they reached the Ellison driveway and stopped. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Fields around the farm were scarred with debris. Trees lay twisted flat. Yet the heart of Martha's homestead remained standing. Bent windmill blades lined the ridge like exhausted soldiers after a battle. One county worker recognized them immediately. "They're the scrap blades." Another removed his cap. Ethan walked slowly toward the ridge. He touched one of the bent blades with both hands. Then he turned toward the growing crowd. The same crowd that had laughed only weeks before. His voice carried farther than he expected. "We all thought she bought junk." He looked at Martha. "We were wrong." No one laughed this time. Because what Ethan Brooks said next would change Marion County long after the storm clouds were gone. The morning after the tornado, the prairie looked as though two different storms had crossed the same county. Northwest of the Ellison farm, grain bins lay folded like crushed tin cups. A machine shed outside Durham had collapsed into a pile of splintered timbers. Power crews worked from sunrise, replacing broken poles while volunteer firefighters cleared county roads blocked by cottonwood trees. Insurance adjusters filled motel parking lots before noon, each carrying clipboards already thick with claims. Yet when they reached Martha Ellison's farm, they slowed almost instinctively. The farmhouse had lost a handful of shingles. Several windows in the machine shed were gone. The western fence had disappeared. But the buildings still stood. The old Farmhouse M waited inside the shed beneath its canvas cover, exactly where Martha had parked it before the storm. Dust covered its hood. A small branch rested across one rear tire. Otherwise, it looked ready to head back into the wheat field. The 12 windmill blades told another story. 5 had bent permanently. 3 leaned several inches from vertical. Every concrete footing remained intact. The ridge itself bore deep scars where wind-driven debris had struck the exposed steel with unbelievable force. Ethan Brooks walked the entire line with a measuring tape, camera, and notebook. He photographed every anchor, every brace, every bent blade. The engineer in him wanted numbers. The man in him wanted understanding. Neither came easily. Over the next several weeks, he compared aerial photographs, National Weather Service damage surveys, topographic maps, and eyewitness accounts. His conclusion surprised even him. The windmill blades had not stopped the tornado. No honest engineer would ever claim that. The tornado remained an immense force of nature. But the reinforced barrier, combined with the natural rise of the ridge and the surviving shelter belt beyond it, appear to have disrupted some of the violent surface inflow immediately surrounding the homestead. That subtle change may have helped shift the storm's most destructive path just enough to spare the central farmstead. It was not magic. It was not certainty. It was thoughtful observation, practical engineering, and decades of paying attention to one piece of land. Ethan included every limitation in his report. He also included one sentence that county commissioners remembered for years. Experience is a form of data, even when it isn't written in an engineering textbook. The report quietly changed minds. No laws were rewritten. No headlines claimed someone had discovered a tornado-proof farm. Instead, Marion County began encouraging landowners to restore shelter belts, preserve natural windbreaks, and study older farming practices that had slowly disappeared during decades of modernization. Several neighboring farmers planted rows of cedar and hedge trees the following spring. Others rebuilt old wind-powered stock wells instead of removing them. Not because they expected miracles. Because they finally respected the wisdom hidden inside ordinary work. Let me tell you about Ethan Brooks. He remained the county engineer for another 22 years. Every newly hired employee eventually heard the story of the 12 windmill blades. When younger engineers dismissed older farmers as stubborn or outdated, Ethan never argued. He simply handed them a copy of Raymond Ellison's weather journals alongside modern weather records. "Read both," he would say. "Then decide which one teaches you more." Most returned a few days later noticeably quieter than before. Let me tell you about Martha Ellison. She never became famous. She never appeared on national television. She refused every interview except one with a local newspaper, where the reporter asked what had inspired her unusual project. Martha smiled the same gentle smile she had worn at the county auction. "I didn't invent anything," she answered. "I just remembered what other people forgot." She continued farming until the autumn harvest of 2007, when arthritis finally persuaded her to lease most of the acreage to a neighboring family. Even then, she insisted on driving the Farmhouse M during community wheat festivals each June. Children waved from hay wagons. Older farmers tipped their caps as she rolled past, the tractor's steady exhaust echoing across the fairgrounds exactly as Raymond would have remembered. Martha passed away peacefully on February 11, 2010, at the age of 84. Her daughter, Helen, inherited the farmhouse, the weather journals, and the old farmhouse. The tractor still starts. Not every time on the first attempt. Machines that old have earned the right to be a little stubborn. But after a touch of choke and the familiar pull of the starter, the 4-cylinder engine settles into the same patient rhythm that has crossed those Kansas fields for more than 75 years. The bent windmill blades remain on the western ridge. Helen never straightened them. Visitors occasionally ask why. She always gives the same answer. They're not damaged. They're doing exactly what they were built to do. Years later, Ethan visited the farm with his grandson. The boy stopped beside one of the weathered blades and asked why anyone would bury something so useful. Ethan rested a hand on the galvanized steel and smiled. Because sometimes the strongest part of a thing is the part nobody ever sees. The child nodded, though he probably understood only half of what his grandfather meant. One day he would understand the rest. The prairie has always rewarded people who listen before they speak, who observe before they judge, and who measure value by generations instead of seasons. Martha Ellison never asked anyone to believe her. She simply did the work, trusted what decades had taught her, and allowed time to finish the argument. Some things aren't saved by being new, they're saved by remembering why they worked in the first place. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly kept solving problems while everyone else dismissed them, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. Maybe it was a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, or an old mechanic who saw value where others saw scrap. Those stories deserve to be remembered just as much as this one. And if you'd like to hear about the Iowa farmer who rescued a forgotten steam engine from a flooded creek and used it to save an entire harvest decades later, I hope you'll join me for that story too. It begins with a rusted boiler, a broken bridge, and one decision that changed an entire community forever.